The week my brother emptied my flower shop's register, smashed the refrigerated display cases, and posted the video to his Instagram with the caption, "Growing season is over." I was 40 minutes away picking up a wholesale order I had driven to get myself because I couldn't yet afford a delivery account. My phone started going off in the passenger seat of my truck somewhere on Route 9. First a text from my part-time assistant Petra, then 2 calls from a number I didn't recognize. Then Petra again. I pulled into a gas station parking lot and answered. Her voice had that particular flatness people use when they're trying to hold the shape of what they're saying together long enough for you to receive it. I sat in the parking lot for 4 minutes. Then I drove the rest of the way to the shop. I had opened Clover Stem on a corner unit in the Ashworth district 3 years before any of this happened. I was 29. I had spent 7 years working as a floral designer for a mid-size event company, hotel lobbies, corporate galas, the kind of work that pays steadily and teaches you everything except how to own the thing you're building. I'd saved $54,000 over 5.5 years in a way that required saying no to a lot of things I wanted. I left the event company on a Thursday and signed my commercial lease on a Monday. The build-out was mine entirely. I sourced the vintage market shelving from an estate sale in Connecticut and drove it back in a rented cargo van with a coworker who owed me a favor. I installed the misting system for the cut flower displays using a YouTube tutorial, a borrowed pipe wrench, and 2 weekends I did not sleep enough. I painted the accent wall myself. A deep sage green that took 3 coats and a consultation with a color specialist whose advice I ultimately ignored in favor of my own instinct, which turned out to be correct. I named the place Clover Stem because both words were structural. Clover meant something low to the ground, persistent, easy to overlook. Stem meant the part that carries everything upward. Both of those things felt true about what I was doing. By the end of year 1, I had 6 standing weekly accounts with local restaurants and a hotel 2 blocks from the waterfront. By the end of year 2, a regional lifestyle magazine had run a 2-page feature with photographs. My mother visited once, looked around and said the arrangements were nice but maybe a little busy. My younger brother Theo never came at all. He sent a text when I opened. It said congrats with a period. 1 word. That was his review. My family had a financial structure that looked like support from the outside. My parents, Kenneth and Sandra, had 2 children. I was the older one who had moved out at 22, declined help with my college costs by picking a school I could manage with loans and work steady, and generally operated on the principle that asking for things created obligations I did not want. Theo was the younger one who had a different relationship with that principle entirely. The accounting, when I eventually sat down with it, was considerable. My parents had paid off a credit card balance of $14,000 when Theo was 24 and had, as they put it, overextended during a difficult period. They had co-signed his apartment lease twice, once in Raleigh, once in Baltimore, when the Raleigh situation did not work out for reasons that were explained to me differently by every family member I asked. They had bought him a used car after his license was suspended following an incident my mother referred to as a misunderstanding and my father referred to as something we don't need to go into. They had fronted $31,000 for a personal training studio concept he had in Charlotte that lasted 14 months before he decided the market wasn't right. I never asked for any of this. I never received any of it either. When I needed a co-signer for my first equipment loan, the refrigeration units were $22,000 and my business credit was not yet established. My father told me he was not in a position to attach his name to commercial debt. He said it in the tone people use when they've made peace with something and would prefer you do the same. Fine. I found a credit union that worked with new small business owners and took a slightly higher rate and paid it off in 19 months. What I did not know, what I had no framework for knowing, was that every dollar my parents had extended to Theo over the years had a source. And that source had a structure. And that structure had a clause in my commercial lease that would eventually matter more than any of it. Theo came to Clover Stem 14 months before he emptied the register. He did not call ahead. He arrived on a Tuesday morning at 11. Looked around the space with the expression he'd had since childhood of someone evaluating something they've decided in advance is smaller than they are, and told me he was starting a wellness content brand. He needed a location for product photography, floral backdrops, natural light, that kind of thing. 3 days a week. He named a number that was approximately 1/3 of what I charged for commercial shoot rentals. He said it like he was doing me a favor by filling the space on days it wasn't fully booked. I told him it didn't work for me. He looked at the sage green wall. He looked at the vintage shelving. He looked at the refrigerated display I had spent 2 weekends installing. Then he said, very quietly, that our father still had good relationships with people in this neighborhood. He said it the way he always delivered those particular lines. As ambient information, not as pressure, not as a threat, just as a fact he was making available to me in case I found it useful. I told him to leave. He left without visible anger, which was the thing about Theo that had always been more unsettling than if he had yelled. He left the way someone leaves when they have simply noted where things are. The video posted on a Saturday morning at 9:04 a.m. I was at the Millbrook Growers Market, which ran every Saturday from 8 to 1, 4 blocks from Clover Stem. I sourced dahlias from a local farm there and had a standing arrangement with the vendor that I'd pick up by 9:30. My phone started vibrating in my jacket pocket and did not stop. A call from Petra. Then a text. Then 2 more calls in the same minute. I answered Petra and she told me what she had seen. I stood between the dahlia vendor and a woman selling honey, holding a bunch of peach cafe au lait dahlias I had just paid for, and I did not say anything for long enough that Petra asked if I was still there. I told her I was. I told her not to touch anything. I ended the call and looked at my phone. Theo had filmed himself entering through the back door, the one that opened onto the alley where deliveries came in, the one for which a spare key had lived on the pegboard in my parents' mudroom for 2 years because I had traveled twice for industry events and needed someone to water the shop plants and accept a delivery. He was wearing a gray hoodie and had clearly dressed for the occasion in the specific way of someone who had thought about what they wanted to look like while doing this. He moved through the shop with the kind of efficiency that meant he had been thinking about it before he arrived. The refrigerated display cases, both of them, the large unit and the smaller one I used for arrangements, were on the floor. The register was open and empty. The vintage shelving had been pulled from the wall. Some of the pieces were broken. The sage green accent wall had been written on in black marker. I could read it from the video. It said busy, which was the word my mother had used. At the end of the video, he looked directly into the camera and the caption read, "Growing season is over." The video had been shared 240 times before I reached the police non-emergency line. A responding officer named Sergeant Willoughby arrived at Clover Stem within 40 minutes, documented the space, and left me her card. She said the charges would depend on the damage assessment and that I should document everything before I touched anything. I photographed every inch of the space with my phone and then with a proper camera Petra had brought. Then I made one call. Her name was Constance Abelkar and she was a commercial attorney I had met 3 years earlier at a small business owner workshop run by the city's Economic Development Office. She was not a friend exactly. She was something that turned out to be more durable than a friend. A person with specific knowledge who answered her phone and said, before I had finished the second sentence, "Stop talking and send me the police report number and your lease." I told her about the key. There was a pause. "Your lease," she said. "Send it now." I had negotiated my commercial lease with attention. I had spent 11 days going through it with a contracts attorney before I signed, and I had asked for several provisions that were not in the standard template the landlord's office had sent over. One of them was Section 8.4. I had asked for it after reading about a situation another business owner in my network had faced. Someone who had given a contractor a key and the contractor had sublet access without permission, which had resulted in a theft and a prolonged dispute about who bore responsibility for the loss. Section 8.4 established that any party who held or had held a key or access credential to the leased premises, whether a formal key holder designated by the tenant or an informal holder by way of the tenant's own arrangement, bore joint and several liability for any damage, theft, or loss caused by a third party who gained entry through their access or through a key or credential they had knowingly or foreseeably allowed to remain accessible to others. I had negotiated that language myself with my attorney and then sat with it for 3 days before deciding it was the version I wanted. Constance, read Section 8.4 in the time it took me to pour a glass of water I did not drink. Who has your key? She said. I told her it was on the pegboard in my parents' mudroom. I told her they had never used it for anything other than the 2 trips I had mentioned, and one time when a delivery came while I had a vendor appointment that ran long. That's not the question I'm asking, she said. Who has your key? I told her my parents did. Then your parents are within the scope of this clause, she said. The damage assessment came back at $61,400. That figure covered the refrigeration units, the register and its contents, the structural cost of reattaching and in some cases replacing the vintage shelving, and the remediation of the accent wall. Petra had 2 kids in elementary school. She was out of income for the 3 weeks Clover Stem was closed. That part did not appear in the damage assessment because it was not mine to claim, but I thought about it every day during those 3 weeks regardless. Theo's attorney, a man named someone I'll refer to only as a man who clearly had not read Section 8.4 before he called me, reached out on a Wednesday. He was polite in the way of someone who has been told the situation is manageable. He walked me through what he described as the likely resolution, which involved restitution for the physical damage and a conditional discharge given that this was a first offense and Theo had expressed remorse to his family. I let him finish. Then I asked him to pull up the lease and read Section 8.4 aloud to me. The silence had texture. It was the specific silence of someone reading something they were not prepared to read. I'll need to review the full document, he said. Take your time, I said. Constance had already filed. The claim was against Theo for the direct damages. It was also against my parents as the parties who had held and maintained access to the key and who had, under the clause, implicitly enabled access by a party who caused substantial damage. The total claim was $61,400. What Constance discovered in the course of her research was that my parents had a home equity line of credit on their house in Merritt Falls, the house at 22 Cordell Drive where they had lived for 21 years. The outstanding balance was significant. The HELOC, like many, carried a covenant. Any civil claim exceeding $50,000 filed against the borrowers triggered a mandatory account review by the lender, a regional bank called Faro Federal. My claim was $61,400. Faro Federal received a copy of the filed action on a Thursday. My father called me on a Friday evening. I could hear the television in the background, which meant he had turned it down but not off, which was something he did when he wanted to convey that the conversation was serious but bounded. He told me I needed to withdraw the claim against him and my mother. He said the house was not the issue. I said the shop was not an abstraction either. He said Theo had made a mistake. I told him Theo had filmed the mistake, captioned it with a reference to something my mother had said to me on her one visit, and posted it publicly. That is not a mistake, I said. That is a statement. He said several other things. I heard all of them. Then I told him, as steadily as I could manage, that I loved him and that I was not going to drop the claim. My mother did not call me herself. She had Theo call. His voice was different from anything I had heard from him before. The performance was gone. The ambient coolness he had maintained since he was about 15 years old. He sounded, for the first time in my memory of him, genuinely scared. Not of me, I understood, of what was attached to the walls of 22 Cordell Drive and what happened to it now. If they have to sell the house, he said, that's because of you. I let the sentence stay where he had put it for a moment. Then I said, you came into something I built with my own hands and my own money and my own 7 years of learning how to do this. You damaged it deliberately. You filmed yourself doing it. You wrote our mother's word on my wall. You posted it with a caption. I would like you to think carefully about who built this particular situation. He started to say something else. I told him I had an insurance call in 10 minutes and ended it there. Faro Federal completed their account review in 22 days. They did not call the line. That would require a final judgment, not a filed claim. But they issued a notification requiring my parents to either post $27,000 in additional collateral within 60 days or accept a refinance at a rate that was substantially worse than what they currently held. My parents did not have $27,000 liquid. The Charlotte studio, the credit card, the Baltimore lease, the Raleigh lease, the car. None of that money was anywhere anymore. The settlement was reached without going to trial. Theo's attorney, who had by that point clearly read Section 8.4 more than once, negotiated a final figure of $54,000, payable over 18 months, with my parents listed as co-obligors on a personal guarantee. The guarantee was secured against the equity in the Cordell Drive property. Sergeant Willoughby called me the following week. Criminal charges had been filed: felony vandalism given the damage amount, theft from a commercial register, and breaking and entering. The video, time-stamped, with his face visible and his own caption attached, was the primary evidence. Theo received a conditional discharge and 210 hours of community service. His attorney had argued effectively for the discharge on grounds of first offense and restitution agreement. I did not contest it. I had what I needed from the civil side. I reopened Clover Stem on a Wednesday morning in late September. Petra came in at 7 and arranged the displays without being asked. A woman who owned the ceramics studio 2 doors down brought a plant, a small eucalyptus in a terracotta pot, and left it on the counter with a card that said, "Welcome back," and nothing else. I made coffee and drank it standing at the window where the refrigerated unit had been before, looking at the refrigerated unit that was there again, rebuilt, running clean, fog slightly at the glass the way it always had in the morning. The sage green wall had been repainted. It took 4 coats to cover what he had written, which was 1 more coat than the original. That detail bothered me more than it probably should have, and then it bothered me less. My parents have my phone number. I have not blocked it. Neither of us has called the other since the settlement documents were signed. We exist in the same state, in the same general orbit of people who know us both, and the way 2 things can occupy the same map without ever actually meeting on it. Theo deleted the video 11 days after he posted it. It had already been archived in 9 places. A woman who made content about workplace injustice had used it in a compilation. A legal commentary account had embedded it in a thread about joint liability. It is not something that goes away. Clover Stem is open 6 days a week. Last quarter was the strongest revenue period since the magazine feature ran 2 years ago. Petra got a raise. The vintage shelving is back on the wall. I found replacement pieces from the same estate sale dealer, who remembered me and gave me a fair price. And the misting system runs exactly the way it did before, which is to say imperfectly but adequately, because I installed it myself and I know where to tap it when it sticks. There is a version of this story in which I was supposed to absorb the loss quietly, reset the space, and file it under the category of things that happen in families and are not discussed further. I know that version well because it's the one I was handed every time Theo's situation required something from my parents and nothing from me. I was supposed to be the one who handled things, the one who didn't need much, the one who grew up and stayed grown up and let other things be someone else's priority. I didn't do that. I'm not certain I'd do it differently. The question I come back to isn't whether I was right. It's simpler and harder than that. Have you ever stopped to think about who holds access to what you've built, and whether they understand that what they're holding is not theirs to give away? I think about the pegboard in my parents' mudroom sometimes. A small wooden board with 6 hooks, maybe 7. A spare key to Clover Stem hanging on one of them for 2 years because I trusted that the people who raised me understood what it meant to hold something that wasn't theirs. They didn't. What I've come to understand, not quickly and not without some grief, is that outcomes like this one don't arrive from nowhere. Theo didn't empty my register because he woke up one morning and randomly chose destruction. He did it because for his entire adult life, the people around him had consistently communicated that consequences were negotiable, that someone would cover it, that he was the kind of person for whom things worked out regardless of what he did. My parents hadn't meant to build that. I don't think they understood they had. But every co-signed lease, every cleared credit card balance, every car purchased after a suspension, each of those things was a small lesson. And the lesson was that his choices didn't fully belong to him. Someone else would absorb them. I built something different. And I built it alone, and that turned out to matter in ways I didn't fully appreciate until a damage assessor walked through my shop with a clipboard. The night I signed my commercial lease, I sat with it for 11 days before I initialed anything. I asked for provisions that weren't in the standard template. I asked for language that made accountability flow upstream, toward anyone who held access, toward anyone who enabled entry. My attorney thought one of the clauses was broader than necessary. I kept it anyway. Not because I expected my brother. Not because I expected my brother and not because I imagined any of what actually happened, but because I had spent 7 years learning that the things you build are only as protected as the frameworks you put around them, and that a framework built in a hurry, or built on the assumption that trust is sufficient, is not really a framework at all. That's not cynicism, it's a kind of clarity I had to earn. What I know now is that doing right by the people in your life, being the reliable one, the one who figures it out, the one who doesn't ask for much, that alone is not a strategy. Character matters, but character without structure is just exposure. I had to pair what I believed about how to treat people with an equal seriousness about how to protect what I had built. Section 8.4 was not an act of distrust, it was an act of respect for the years I had put in. And when everything broke, what carried me through wasn't anger. It was that I had done the work before the crisis arrived. The lease was already written. Constance already had my number. Petra already knew where the camera was. I had built the shop to last, and I had built the legal scaffolding around it to hold under pressure, and when the pressure came, it held. Theo had to reckon with something he had never been required to reckon with before. My parents had to reckon with what it had cost to protect him from that reckoning for 20 years. I didn't engineer that. I just refused to absorb it on their behalf one more time. Clover Stem is open. The sage green wall took 4 coats to repaint and it's exactly the color I chose. That's not nothing.